So this is called the Turn Against Over Tourism, the Turn Against brackets over close brackets tourism. My name is Austin Williams, Future Cities Project, etc., etc. I'm chairing this session, and I've asked the speakers to do just a 3-minute intro, very, very brief, short, punchy, and then I'll come straight out to yourselves if you have any comments or questions you want to ask. Just to give you a bit of background, the last year on the tourism conversation, there were campaigns in the Netherlands that saw anti-tourism being at the forefront of a kind of a revulsion against too many people coming into Holland. Holidaymakers sprayed by water pistols in Spain. Venice has a pedestrian congestion charge. The Maldives just last week has introduced a departure tax. So you can go there on holiday, but you can't leave. Prague has banned pub crawls. This is our audience, isn't it? To attract, quotes, more cultured tourists. And then closer to home, so tourism kind of covers multifacets. There's a British headline recently, 2 weeks ago, clueless tourists are ruining the Scottish Highlands for the rest of us. And another headline in Devon and Cornwall said, holiday lets are depriving communities of much needed housing. So there's a lot to kind of get our teeth into here. Is tourism a problem, the problem, or actually is it a necessity? Is it actually a benefit? So to discuss this, we've got a really good panel. Jim Butcher, starting off there on far left, is Reader of Geography of Tourism at Christchurch, Canterbury University. He writes the Tourism Horizon Substack and is the author of Volunteer Tourism, the Lifestyle Politics of International Development. Next to speak will be Katie Glass in the middle. She's a feature writer, most famously, just speaking to her earlier, her article on the post office scandal inspired the TV documentary. She's too modest to say so, but for the purpose of this panel, she's an award-winning travel journalist. And then we have Emma Zaoli is from Spain. You know, they come over here. Anyway, she's an international relations student. She's been a Spanish delegate to the United Nations Youth Assembly in New York, and I'm sure she will raise in some way, shape or form concerns about tourism to Barcelona and Madrid, but we'll see what happens. Okay, that's your panel. Going to crack on with Jim. 3 minutes. I'll be fairly brutal with you, and then we'll come out to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I wanted to say a little bit about where this word over-tourism came from, because it hasn't been around too long. It started really in 2017-18 with some protests in Barcelona organised by an anarchist youth group called Aran Jovent. The protests were incredibly small, in some cases 2 or 3 people jumping on a tour bus, for people going on a tour to the Nou Camp Stadium, throwing paint around and so on. I think the biggest they managed was about 30 people on a beach. However, this term, within 6 months, certainly within a year, became part of the language of the United Nations World Tourism Organization, the World Economic Forum, numerous NGOs, and virtually every geographer that I know commissioned a book on it straight away to say how terrible tourism was. I was the exception to that. Anyway, very, very quickly, in 2018, the term began to be applied very, very widely. And some of the various things have been mentioned there. Dubrovnik, Thailand, the Isle of Skye, very, very different kind of places, Venice, Edinburgh. Jump forward to today, we've had protests a little bit bigger, not much bigger, depending who you listen to, between about 3,000 and 8,000 people behind a banner saying mass tourism kills the city. Organised by the Neighbourhood Assembly for Degrowth. Okay. How popular are these kind of ideas within Barcelona itself? How far do they represent a kind of bottom-up, if you like, populist sentiment amongst the ordinary people? Fortunately, the Barcelona government published a very handy yearly opinion poll, which gives us some insight into this. Last year, when they did this poll, 71% of people said that tourism was beneficial versus 17% against. For Catalonia as a whole, 83% of people said it was beneficial against 8%. 61% of people did say that Barcelona was close to the limits that it can take. And this is what I'm using Barcelona as an example here, and other places can be very, very different to this. 36% of people said Barcelona should attract more people, and 50% of people said the region round and about should attract more, with 30% against. Only 13% of people thought that tourism was a major contributor to antisocial behaviour, And perhaps surprisingly, only 16% of people thought it was a substantial contributory factor in apartment prices, which has obviously been a very important thing. So we have to put these things in crisis, but I've no doubt tourism being a kind of unique industry that involves people travelling and accommodation. You buy any other product, or if countries export any other product, it travels from one to another. You don't have that kind of cultural encounter. So there are very real issues there. But I think we have to put these things in the context of an industry that's brought a lot of incredibly good things, that's helped cities like Barcelona transition, and deal with the sort of deindustrialization that they were going, that was happening regardless of tourism. And I really think when we approach these questions, we've got to try and have our cake and eat it, have tourism and address some of the negative things, not one or the other. And I think that's the problem with some of the debate.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Very good. Okay. If you would, Katie.
Well, first of all, I feel like a bit of a fraud because unlike the sort of academics on here, I'm really just someone who likes to go on holiday. So that's how I kind of come at this debate. So I guess I hear the word over-tourism and I just immediately think snobbishness. To me, it just smacks of that sort of John Kerry's The Intellectuals and the Masses, where we know travel was once something only some people could afford to do. Now everyone can afford to do it. You know, the people who used to be able to do it don't like it very much. So once truly travel was a sort of idea of the grand tour. It was a sort of very rich people could afford to do it. It was a rarefied, rare sort of commodity that you would get to go on these wonderful, see the world. And then in the 50s, with the rise of the sort of package holidays, suddenly it was available for more people. So the middle classes started to travel too. Much more recently, really, in only the last few decades, with the advent of package holidays and initially platforms like Airbnb, suddenly travel became much more widespread. And actually the people who are really traveling now are emerging markets like sort of India, China, Indonesia, Vietnam. So I think over-tourism is like now everyone can go traveling. The people who used to be able to go and have Venice themselves are a bit sort of hacked off about it. Like you said, the term over-tourism really only came out in sort of 2017. Well, what had sort of happened? This growth of the idea of over-tourism. During COVID, if you were privileged enough to live somewhere wonderful like Barcelona or Venice or Bath, you got into the idea during COVID, how wonderful. You got to sit in St. Mark's Square on your own. You got to walk down Las Ramblas and no one was there. And then suddenly, post-COVID, everyone wanted to come back and you didn't really like the idea very much. So again, we have this very sort of spoiled, really very privileged people living in these locations that don't quite like the idea that everyone gets to descend on them. But I'm sorry, I sort of feel that everywhere is for everyone and you haven't got the right to say, sorry, you can't visit Bath. So I guess I think there are two solutions to over-tourism. As someone who grew up, first of all, in Snowdonia and then in Bath, I'm so excited when people started going to Snowdonia in lockdown, it just sort of delighted me. And in Bath in the summer, even though it's complete hell, I'm sort of so excited to see the tourists, some of them fueled by like Bridgerton, who will be coming to the city for the first time, see the beautiful Georgian architecture. I noticed that in places like Skegness or Butlins or Disney, we don't really talk about over-tourism. And it's because the kind of people who go to those locations are used to sharing them with other people. So I have a radical solution to over-tourism, which is simply you can only go somewhere once. If you're going to Venice for the 10th time and you want to complain it's much busier than it was the first time you went there, then I'm sorry, it's time to move on. And instead of telling people, oh, you should try the island next door, you should be trying the island next door. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. Very good. And Emma, if you would.
Hi. So just to provide a little bit of context, I was born in Spain, raised in Spain. I'm half British, so I can also make the argument for British tourists in Spain. However, contrary to the belief that I'm anti-tourism in Spain, I'm actually a big, big supporter of tourism in Spain. Because despite some citizens, Barcelona citizens, really enjoying the feel of their streets and having it all to themselves during COVID, there was a big, big proportion of their population that suffered because they were out of a job. A lot of their population, they work in tourism and they rely on all of these tourists coming in every year and sustaining their economy. I know that Spain would not be doing well economically at all if it weren't for tourism. I think in 2023, our GDP, our tourism accounted for 12.3% of our GDP. That's an insane amount of money that's going into our economy. And that's all thanks to tourism. However, just to play devil's advocate a little bit, the reason why a lot of people in Spain, and I'm making the Spain argument because I'm more experienced to talk about this. The reason why there's so much hate against tourists and the reason why people in Barcelona were spraying people with water guns is because of the behavior that some tourists have. Now, I don't think it's snobbish to say, oh, you shouldn't be traveling and making the most of low prices. That's completely fair. That's understandable. It's, supply and demand. If the flights are there, people are going to book them. However, I think citizens are entitled to expect a degree of respect from people who come on holiday to Spain. And if you look at areas like Benidorm, if you look at areas like Magaluf, you're not seeing tourists be respectful. You're seeing tourists completely trash cities. In the words of the mayor of Calvià, which, for those of you who don't know, has Magaluf inside of it, he said, in your country, you cannot urinate in the street, walk around with alcohol, drinking as if there is no tomorrow, or being half naked. And the message is that it's the same here. Now, I wouldn't say, oh, we should completely cut off tourism in these areas of Spain, but there are measures that are being put into place to limit this and to limit the extent to which the cities are getting trashed. So, for example, I think it was in Ibiza that some bars were shutting at 10 o'clock, so you couldn't buy any more alcohol after 10 o'clock to sort of limit the extent to which people were getting drunk in the streets. So again, I think it's all about striking a balance. I think tourism is extremely important. I don't believe in limiting tourism, but I believe in trying to address the root, which is disrespectful tourism. Now, I'm not saying Spanish people are saints either. They've probably done the same in many other locations. But I think that's where most of the hate comes from, because most Spanish people understand that there is a crucial need in Spain for tourism. And we're very welcoming of tourists. We love tourists, love practicing Spanish people love practicing their English when tourists come. So welcome tourists, just be respectful. That's my argument today.
Thank you very much indeed. Very good. So, there's a lot on the table, whether it's elite, whether it's the obverse of that, which is the fact that some tourists are rude and obnoxious. I've always found it amazing that when you do go to the south of Spain, there's so many expats, as we like to call them, actually live there. The idea that there would be that many Spanish people living in somewhere in Cleethorpes, it just wouldn't we wouldn't hack it, would we? But also, I have been to China. I've been to the Great Wall during Spring Festival, and if you want to see over-tourism by Chinese people, it's absolute hellish. You can't move for a million. Literally millions of people. So there are interesting, pragmatic, practical problems, and there's political issues at stake here. So I'm really kind of going to throw it open to you for any observations that you might have had, any personal observations or stories, or whether you think that tourism is acceptable. One of the little pieces of footage I sent to the panelists was a World Economic Forum film, which I don't normally send to people, from Davos, which actually had a piece by the South African kind of tourism officer saying, I wish we had over-tourism, but we don't. What we do have is seasonal tourism. Over-tourism is simply a lack of new, developed, exciting destinations. So, maybe it is the fact we all go to Magaluf, and maybe we should go further down the coast to experience a little bit more openness. Anyway, any kind of comments or thoughts on this?
Hello, thank you very much. Actually, but I have to say that I travel a lot, and every time I travel, I raise a glass of whiskey to memory of Wright brothers, whose invention allowed us to go abroad. And one thing is that I have a lot of people try to guilt trip me that my CO2, my carbon footprint is too high by doing tourism. You shouldn't do this. Actually, reading your book yesterday reminded me of that thing again. What do you think of this way of we try to be guilt tripped not to be tourists?
I can't remember which country it was, but in the Euros, it was in some international football, and the country said, some authority in the country said to Scottish football fans, "You guys come again, we like you." And the frame of reference was English football fans who conducted themselves, and from my perspective, conduct themselves generally disgracefully when they go abroad. Are the Scottish just better than us, or is there something else?
Putting another perspective, I have worked in the travel industry for 16 years as a tour manager with one of the big names that you'll see on TV. It's been a very interesting experience. A lot of my customers have a busy life because they need to go home for a couple of weeks to relax after a holiday before they go on the next one. The grey pound is very, very strong. And maybe after 16 years, I'm getting a little cynical, and they are pretty much lovely people. But I think a large part of the motivation is status. And another large part of the motivation is getting away from a life that maybe isn't as much fun as you thought it would be when you had plenty of money. So I just throw that in.
Thank you. I think the panel made a really great case for tourism between the three of them, kind of economically, socially, kind of in terms of development, of kind of people's liberation, etc. But you kind of have to cast your mind back to the summer. You know, if you think May, June, that's when it seemed to start in every single national newspaper. You know, every time you opened a paper, there was article after article about the kind of the plague of tourists, you know, vermin almost. I mean, it seemed at one point, you know, the scourge of tourism. It was just no insult was like too low. It couldn't be hurled at tourism. So I guess my question is this a kind of an us problem or a them problem? You know, is this this kind of concern with over-tourism? Is this something that we generate ourselves in this country? Are we kind of more concerned about it than them over there where we are going? And you know, surely there must be more than just snobbery to blame for, you know, to explain what's going on here.
So look, come back to the panel. Who wants to kick off? You haven't got to answer all of these questions.
I agree with you about the guilt tripping about flying. I had a very sweet Irish hippie living with me recently in Somerset who was absolutely adamant he was not going to fly anywhere anymore. And he wanted to go home to Ireland for Christmas. And we looked and it was like 12 quid to get a flight to Dublin. But the cost of getting the train and then the ferry and then another, it was hundreds and hundreds of pounds. So, I mean, I do think, again, you know, there's a sort of snobbishness, and maybe people who've already had a wonderful time going to exotic destinations then have the privilege of saying, oh, you know what, I've decided I'm not going to fly anymore. I also think it's a luxury for people who don't just have 2 weeks off work in which they get to go and have a holiday. You know, like, how long does it take to get the train? I recently drove to the south of France and then drove back. And I mean, I needed like a month to do that whole trip and stop on the way. So I do think so often people who are complaining about cheap flights and complaining about people flying and saying, you know, we shouldn't fly anymore, it's just a sort of privileged position to take.
Well, just very quickly, the book by Alain de Botton on the art of travel, right, basically argues counter to that, which basically says, if it's that far to travel and takes that long to travel to the south of France, stop going to the south of France, right, and enjoy your locality.
I'm in the south of France.
Yeah, I know, but the point he makes is that we don't even know our locality. Yes. So, you know, he finishes his book with this kind of rather pathetic idea of you can walk along the street and observe the interesting cracks in the pavement, and it's more fascinating than the stones of Venice. So, you know, like that idea of about knowing our place, literally and metaphorically, is kind of part of that environmental agenda. Stay home. There's actually really fascinating things to do in this country.
Alain de Botton, who is a multi-millionaire whose family have homes all over the world, is like a perfect case in point for someone who would say, I don't think you should fly anymore. With all due respect, I just think it's the worst example.
God, you've got to think about wealth. Jim, going to say?
Yeah, briefly, on the flying and flight shaming and things like that. My position on this is regarded as a bit controversial. I think the airline should be given a bit more time and a bit of a free pass, really, because if you're flying at altitude and you're trying to carry a battery, when we're talking about, you know, an energy revolution transition where you know, we're assuming that power will be created and stored in batteries, at altitude is almost impossible to do. It's not like industries on the ground or driving a car on the ground or your house or anything like that. We do need to support the airline industry. We do need to support travel, to support growth, to create profits, and those profits can be used to innovate and develop, you know, new generations of fuels and solutions to these problems. The problem is a lot of the people who object to this see things in a kind of very static and sort of zero-sum game. You fly, it's a problem. They don't seem to reckon with the fact that you do need profits. You need a surplus to reinvest to resolve these problems over time. So I'm very pro-flying, unlike the flight shamers. And as for Joe's point here about the water pistols and all of these things kicking off yeah, I mean, actually, when you looked at some of the bigger protests in places like Tenerife, the reporting suggested that the large majority of people were at pains to point out that they were not against tourism, a little bit like the opinion polls in Barcelona. They were in favour of tourism, but they did think, in the case of Tenerife, that a particular new development was going too far. It was going too far. And that, you know, gave rise to various other kinds of grievances. So I think the thing is here, two things can be true at once. people can be very in favour of tourism and appreciate its benefits and see it as beneficial for them as a host community, but at the same time can have regret about certain aspects of cultural loss and rapid change that they feel is out of their control. And I think there is, at times, maybe, and this needs a lot more kind of research to find out, but I think there is a certain potentially little positive populist impulse to that very unpopular phrase in the circles I move in, to take back control of your destiny and your society and your physical environment. I think there's something positive in that, at least.
Very good. All right. Thanks, Emma.
I wanted to tackle the last question over here about whether it's an us problem or a them problem. I think it comes down to supply and demand. If the flights are there and they're cheap, people are going to buy them, they're going to travel. People from the UK, for example, usually have higher spending power than Spanish people, for example, and that's why they choose to invest in properties abroad, particularly south of Spain, Barcelona, etc. Now, by doing this, they price a lot of locals out of their local areas. Like they have to, rent or purchase a house that's very far away from the place where they work. So that's a problem, and that's where a lot of the resentment comes from. And that's also why these properties then attract more and more tourists, because they're sort of sold by the people who used to be tourists themselves. So I don't think you can really say to tourists, don't travel, it's morally wrong or morally incorrect because of your, I don't know, a carbon footprint. Like, look at everyone taking private jets. I think that's a much bigger issue that we need to tackle, not commercial flights anyway. But if you want to actually regulate it, you do need to strike a balance that still allows tourism, but that also prevents locals from suffering from this in a way that will be financial. So the regulation needs to come from local authorities in, for example, preventing people from purchasing a house and making it into an Airbnb, which has actually already happened. I think Airbnb have imposed some regulations in Barcelona that say you need to pay a really significant tax if you're not a Spanish person purchasing a property there. So that profit is then used to sort of subsidize the costs of tourists. So if you apply this, obviously there's complications, but if you were to apply this across most cities and other parts of the world, I think that would be quite a viable solution to tackling it.
Yeah, very good. Thanks. Just in terms of, we haven't answered the Scottish football fan trick, and obviously I'm from Wales and we know nothing about football, but I do remember the COVID conversation when you had those kind of signs saying English stay away. The border of Scotland, so it had a broader remit about keeping people out of the country. But I think COVID, in some ways, was a shift in the conversation about what is legitimate to stop, other people from moving, stay home, stay lives, and all the rest of it. And that idea that there's a distinction between two things. One is that post-COVID, there is a joy, as Katie was saying, in seeing crowds of people out and about. Even now, I kind of still think it's a remarkable reminder of the thing we try to forget, which was COVID lockdown. Second thing is that, there was a distinction way back when, I think, which was a distinction between tourists and travelers. Tourists are the guys who go to Torremolinos and get pissed, and travelers go to Chengdu and cuddle a panda or something, right? The morally superior version. And that level of distinction is kind of worth working out, because it is then business flights are acceptable, but EasyJet is unacceptable. And then I suppose the final thing, I did a session, I think at the Battle many years ago on environmentalism, and there was a woman who sat there and said, 50 years ago or so, her family left Ireland to go to America, and she knew she'd never see them again. And then Ryanair started flying to America, and she could go there for £100, right? And it was almost like there wasn't a dry eye in the house, let me tell you, right? But you do think that actually travel broadens the mind. Travel gives you those experiences, and even if it's a piss up hen night in Prague, right? It either broadens your mind or it maybe broadens the mind of people in Prague. But I do think experiences are very worthwhile from travel experiences. Okay, we'll take this gentleman with a paper and then you, sir.
Scottish football fans should all be arrested en masse for ginger wigs and all that sort of nonsense. I very much agree with Jim. I mean, there's two things going on here. I mean, if you look at the stats for Spain, British tourists travelling last year, 19 million. That's people who live there. There's various other things. Consular assistance was given to 2,290 for arrests. More people, 7,500 for lost passports, probably pissed. Currently in Spanish prisons, there are only 112 British people serving time, right, out of 90. So the idea that British tourists behave badly in Spain, I think, is largely a myth. Spanish know how to deal with it. I lived in Spain. Spanish know how to deal with British tourists, which is why there's so few arrests. So I think it's blown out of all proportion, etc., as we've said. But I do think there are certain issues locally which local authorities can assert. So I don't have a problem with departure taxes, for example. The Prague central government recently, it wasn't banning piss-ups, it was banning organised groups of people being carted around Prague 1. And if anybody's been to Prague 1, you see what that means. So there is a place for local elected representatives, not people with water guns, for a conversation within local communities about what they will and will not accept. And I think measures on Airbnb are perfectly acceptable. We've all used Airbnb, but it is disruptive and it can be disruptive towards rents. So I think the question could be, let's leave aside the panic over tourism, but where there are perhaps individual issues on the ground within certain communities, if those communities' elected representatives want to deal with it, then I see no problem with that.
I must admit, until your last contribution there, Austin, I had forgotten that one of the reasons why we all hated lockdown was as it legitimated Welsh people being disagreeable. I live in a small mill town in the middle of the Pennines, and I think that we look at this issue, from my experience in that area, very much hypocritically. The mill town was destroyed by the destruction of the rag trade in the 60s. Tons of empty space, tons of empty commercial space, which pioneering individuals in the 70s and 80s then turned into alternative industries, including tourism. And, the place has now become a centre for mountain biking. And yet the facilities to allow people to come and enjoy our district and spend money in our district are always criticised. Very recently, there was a big campaign against Airbnbs setting up in Hebden Bridge. And, for what reason? There aren't that many of them. Many of them are converted commercial or farming buildings that haven't really got any other use. But people have this fear that there are going to be hen or stag parties, that they're going to be misused and rowdy. And it's all just yet another example of moral panic, plus jealousy. That people don't like owners of second homes. Because if you're providing a second home, then that should really have been provided to a local person as a tenancy. And, just tough shit to the local tourism industry. Meanwhile, the same people, the same local district, live in a dark, damp community at the bottom of the valley. And my goodness, at this time of year, we need to be able to get out to a sunnier place like Spain. And we're using the cheap flights, and we're using the accommodation provided on Airbnb outside in the places which give us some relief from our terrible climate. The hypocrisy in our attitude to tourism is startling. We are simultaneously benefiting from an industry which we also use ourselves abroad.
Hi, this is a snobby comment, but against a snobby echelon, which is about like the social media influencers. And the kind of places they stay and promote, and what's the purpose of their travel. It's not to get to know a culture, it's to have the selfie and show everybody you did that. And I had a dear friend who came to London a couple of years ago and only stayed, at the Soho House places, and they're now in the countryside. And when I said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, do you want to I like to go to the small places like the Dickens House. She's like, well, no, they said we have to go. They've done this thing with a place called the Battery Park Power Station, and we have to go to it. They've reopened it. I was like, that is a mall. And, and she saw my point, but that thing is replicated across. In New York, the equivalent is Hudson Yards, which is a result of this thing called the High Line, which they did, which was a wonderful, beautiful thing to do, but it immediately got overwhelmed, and the whole neighborhood gets converted into a millionaire, billionaire's playhouse. And there's so many things in there. There was no affordable housing, there was no this or that, but it just so I'm snobby. I'm like, oh God, you went to Hudson Yards? It's just disgusting and soulless. And this is very Alan de Botton, I think, to talk about the blandification. But anyway, there's no question, but you're welcome to respond.
Very good, very good.
Yeah, it was just on this point about where you said about it takes a long time to get there than the actual time there. I mean, one of the things that impresses me is the kind of
way that people can innovate about tourism, to be honest, and about people having a holiday. So a friend of mine runs a company which takes people's motorbikes off them in the UK, gets them shipped to North Africa. They get a cheap flight over there, get on their motorbike, go around on their motorbikes, and the motorbikes that they then come back. And to me, that just shows that the way in which some people are what do they say? Cash rich, time poor. And the way that we can innovate and the way that certain people can kind of spot a gap in the market and provide these things means that we can experience things that people would never been able to dream of. And going on your own motorbike, around these places is far better. For some reason, for people who own motorbikes, they tell me they much prefer to go around their bike than someone else's. But that's one of the great things, I think, that we've been able to do over the last few years.
Short and sharp. Do you want to go first, Jim, and then you, Emma?
A couple of very short points, excellent points. I agree with a lot of what's been said. First thing is the COVID thing. I mean, perhaps it's working in a university. A lot of people interpreted COVID as a kind of good thing. A reset, where we all learnt to be more sustainable and appreciate the world around us. I think this is at odds with reality. I mean, I think that people suffered greatly, the lack of conviviality, opportunities to socialise. I spent the period after COVID telling my students, you've missed out. Now you've got to go out twice as much, travel twice as much to make up for it. But likewise for the hosts, many people's whose livelihoods and whose economies were dependent upon this were bereft, and many still are. And people talk about over-tourism. Who's talking about under-tourism? And can I just say at this point, I coined that term in an article in Spiked a few years ago. So if anybody tries to lay claim to it, it was one day it'll be as big as over-tourism, under-tourism. And there are, as it happens, thousands of miles of East African coastline without a tourist to be seen, where people are crying out for development, stability and business. And we should remember that on a global scale, that's the case. Very, very briefly, mentioned the traveller tourist thing. It's a very, very interesting thing, I think, because I've always been a big defender of tourists, and the snobbery of the traveller was something that I sort of looked upon with disdain. But I think they've been hoisted by their own petard, because for many years they were saying, you got to live like a local, you got to go to new places. But now people are turning around and saying, well, if tourism's destructive, living like a local, Airbnb in a local community is the worst thing you can do. Maybe you should stay in a resort with all of the plebs. And here you get other kind of anti-human arguments on the other side of things here. But it's important to cut through that and say it's all mass tourism, it's all good. And actually, if you've got a mind to be a traveller, why not?
Very good. Thank you. Emma?
I would come back to the social media influencing point, because I've got a lot to say on that. I mean, I'm Gen Z. I spend way too much time on TikTok. Don't even want to tell you my screen time. And I have firsthandly been shamed into not going to Southeast Asia for my gap year. Like, you just open TikTok and there's, you just see this front cover going, if you don't spend your 20s traveling the world, then what are you doing? You're going to die and be sad and miserable. So right, the comments are full of, oh, can anyone drop some recommendations? Or, oh, I went to Southeast Asia when I was 21 and I met my husband, never looked back. So you've got all of these viewers thinking that they have to go to Southeast Asia on a gap year. And they're obviously going to go to the most sort of, touristy, attractive places. And the question is, are they traveling because they want to, or because they've been shamed into not traveling here? So, not saying, oh, you shouldn't be allowed to enjoy your 20s and travel to wherever you want to go, but I think it should be more of a conscious decision, and planning a trip you want to do, seeing what you want to do, trying to be ethical about it, rather than sort of buying into the social media trap of going to these places that are full of tourists. I've not been to Southeast Asia myself, but there's this place somewhere around there. I don't know if it's like Thailand or Indonesia. I think they're building a glass lift to get down from one of the cliffs down to the beach, because it's got so many tourists who were complaining about all the stairs, which was sort of natural. So I think things like this and a new infrastructure being built in these remote natural locations, yes, it's driving tourism and it's probably boosting their economy, but to what extent is it also harming the environment because of some social media trend that won't be alive in 5 years' time? And then you're gonna buy into, oh, let's go to, I don't know, South America now, and then that's all the trend. So I think people need to be careful and be more critical where they travel to, and not sort of buy into these traps that are set up by influencers who also have a profit incentive. Airbnb pay influencers to advertise their Airbnbs. Most cute aesthetic coffee shops that sell matcha lattes. They are paying the influencers to advertise them. So yeah, I think you need to be more critical when you travel. That's my overall
Good.
criticism.
Thank you. Speaking of influencers, Katie.
Well, I guess just 2 short points to go back to my class obsession. I do think, in terms of the football fans and sort of talking about the Mayor of Malaga, we do disproportionately sort of criticise the holiday antics of the working class. Whereas in fact, we know it's the luxury class of travel that causes most problems to a local economy, or gives the least to a local economy, because it's people who are staying in globally owned hotels, and they want certain wine shipped in from other countries and so on. So that's to that point. And then I guess I think your point about social media is absolutely right. I think over-tourism ultimately probably really comes down to a sort of lack of imagination. We're all guilty really of it, of seeing somewhere online and thinking, oh, that's a nice picture, I would like to go there. And then go there, sharing the picture on social media, in which we crop out all the crowds of all the other people who are there, therefore like encouraging a new generation of people to go thinking there'll be only one in Venice. So yeah, social media is to blame, as always.
I think Emma's turned the conversation around to saying traveling is a bad thing. I thought we started off quite well. I think more travel is good. But there was one thing about coming back to the Welsh point. There used to be this old thing many, many years ago saying, come home to real fire, buy a house in Wales. Do you remember that when they used to set fire to English second homes in Wales? But there is this now idea that, there are lots and lots of shrinking cities and towns, right? If you go to North Wales, South Wales, anywhere, you can find lots of places where people are emptying out, because why would you want to stay in Hebden Bridge, right? I mean, you might want to move. That's a very general open question, but people are leaving, and therefore should these places be protected from going into decline, or should they be allowed to go into decline? And therefore, a lot of these places only survive by having tourism, and it might be seasonal, but that's the way it goes. Anyway, that's an open question to everybody, but yes.
Hi, yes, Abby Wood. I run a homestay. So I've been doing Airbnb for about 14 years now, but I believe it's all about balance. I remember reading a quote once that said, tourism is the fire that warms the hearth, but it's also the fire that can destroy. I'm very much a fan of cultural placemaking, and Charles Landry, he's written some fantastic books on this, which is basically about being proud of your place, understanding the cultural identity of a place, social cohesion and community. So I promote these elements in Stroud, where I have my my homestay, and I offset that with working at a food bank, working with homeless people, and also working as a trustee for a community venue that's run by the community. So yes, I just believe it's about balance, but it's about doing things as holistically, going back to what Airbnb was originally for, putting an airbed in a front room, being holistic about welcoming people into your home, getting to understand the cultural indigenous elements of an area. But, you have a responsibility to keep that balance. Thank you.
So one of the things I actually wanted to understand that has kind of been touched on a little bit is one of the issues that I think we sort of see as like symptomatic of over-tourism is things are quite expensive. You can't just walk up to a place now. You have to book in your time slot. All of those kind of additional things. But I see a lot of the arguments around over-tourism coming from quite big countries that have quite big governments. I think sort of like your Spain, your France, your Italy, all those types of things. And I wonder if, I don't know, maybe we're looking at the problem in kind of the wrong way. Like, you might go to a place and there's, a monopoly on ferry companies, for example, there's tourist taxes, all those types of things. And those governments often have quite a lot of red tape and restrictions around innovation and companies and all those types of things. So I guess I wanted to understand if we think that, I guess, some of this over-tourism is, I guess, somewhat self-inflicted in terms of the lack of, innovation and, I guess, their ability for businesses to kind of do new things or spread out tourists to other places as well.
I live in London, and something I've noticed when I go into, the centre of London is that all of the tourist hotspots are really close together. So I'm just wondering, would that have an influence maybe on the infrastructure, and maybe in the case of over-tourism, maybe the infrastructure might not be able to cope with the number of people who want to go to, say, Westminster Abbey or the London Eye.
Very good. Very good point.
Like a lot of people in this room, I'm a big fan of traveling. I've been to many countries and feel fortunate to have done so. But when I go to a country, I think a lot of the reasons I go there is the people, and the experiences. So I don't know if I'd want to go to a place where if people actively didn't want tourists there, I don't feel particularly want to go to that particular place. So one idea I thought of is, if there was a way of governments maybe communicating to travel companies, if there's too many people during that booking time that are going to be in the place, there's some kind of notification when you're booking a ferry or a flight that says, warning, too many people are going to be here. Then you might rethink it and think, actually, I'm going to go to, I don't know, Morocco rather than Barcelona, for example.
That
So
car park is full.
exactly, something like that. So then you might think twice and think, you know what, actually, it's going to be an unpleasant experience and one I might do off-peak rather than the peak times.
One of my pet peeves is the word staycation, sort of this idea that anywhere that holiday in the UK isn't a holiday. I think that in itself is evidence of over-tourism and maybe the fact that we are a bit snobby about holidaying in the UK. Maybe if we did it more, it would take some of the pressure off elsewhere.
Just very quickly, the warning sign is school holidays. I think focusing on the Barcelona example, because Barcelona is the one that has really thrown up. The people to blame for over-tourism in Barcelona are the Catalans. Because they deregulated their market in the early 90s, encouraged every low-cost carrier to fly in there as part of their development plan after the Olympics or during the Olympic period. So it's a bit rich for Catalans to turn around now to say we've got too many tourists. But tourists are an easy people to attack. And the people that did the water guns and all the rest of it, they're picking on a very lazy, easy target. If they have issues that they want to raise, then raise it with their local representatives and do Catalan politics. Don't take it out on the tourists. It gets amplified through the British media because they're always after a silly season story. But what they're really doing is dodging their responsibilities to act as citizens in their own communities. And that's where they should direct their fire.
Emma's busting to get in on that contemptible remark. Emma, go on.
I completely agree.
Oh.
No, I do completely agree. I've got some points to make on this. It is Catalan hypocrisy, 100%. Their main argument to leave Spain relies on we bring in most of the tourism in Spain. We're pulling our weight here. Why isn't Spain pulling their weight? Therefore, we want to leave Spain. So it's extremely unfair on tourists as well for their population to be taking out this anger on tourists when it's their own government that's sort of sabotaging them because they want to, strongman Madrid, especially the capital, which runs most of the administration in Spain, to let them leave or to give them more benefits or to pay them more, etc. So yeah, I completely agree. Just wanted to make that point.
Very good. Thank you very much, Emma.
Oh, I was just going to ask your point about people going at peak times, which I think that is what Venice's tourist tax is all about, isn't it? So it's not a blanket tourist tax. Is that certain days where they know they're going to be really busy, it's €5 if you want to go, and so you can avoid those days if you want to. And I do think that's an excellent idea because who wants to go when there's tons of other people?
Is this summing up? Okay, yeah, and I think it's really, really interesting discussion. Another place that's been associated with this is Amsterdam. It's very interesting. After the financial crisis in 2008, Amsterdam went for tourism in a big way to address their economic problems. So tourism was a way of addressing a problem. Then it caused a problem. Okay, so that's a nice problem to have. And it's a problem that you can approach with a degree of optimism, in the spirit of resolving things at a higher level of development. So I think the question is really not that there aren't problems, there are problems. We can discuss the extent to which, antisocial behaviour and the housing crisis, I think the latter is, quite significant. It's how we approach those problems. It's how we sort of oriented towards them. And I think Thomas Cook had it about right back in Victorian England. He defended the masses on their holidays. He said travel is for the millions who can, I can't remember the whole quote, but who can overleap their status and see parts of the world that they never saw before. And that'll be the experience of many of us. We'll have travelled to places our parents and grandparents, if they ever saw them, it would have been with a gun over their shoulder to fight in a war. There's a lot of progress here. I think that a piss-up is a rite of passage for every red-blooded Englishman. I mean, I'm absolutely going to defend that. And these are not new issues, and took me back to mid-1980s. I can't remember much of it, but going to Mallorca isn't kind of not new issues. But there is a degree of moral panic about them now, I think. Maybe they're overstated. And I wanted to also say that, reiterate this point, that globally, if you look at tourism globally, a lot of the new aspirant tourists are coming from China, as Austin will know, and India. I think the majority of people in China don't have a passport, so that'll be rising very rapidly. They'll want to travel. I mean, we do have to confront and look optimistically at the aspirations of our fellow human beings, wherever they come from. And I think we do have to look at the potential in technology and opening up new places in order to address that. So it's under tourism. The glass is belly here. It's not brimming over.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. Can we have a round of applause to the panel, please?